Good evening, everyone. Hear me? All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rebecca Bannon, the chair of the Parent Community Network. I wanted to thank you all for coming out tonight and joining us. It's really great to have everybody here to be able to come together as a community. And I just wanted to take a little bit of the time to tell you about the Parent Community Network. So we're a volunteer group of parents, educators, and community members from the L2 area. And we work to bring our community ongoing parent education and support to help raise healthy and well-adjusted kids and families. So our goal is to bring educational seminars, workshops, documentaries, screenings, and other media types to try to enhance communication, information sharing, and networking amongst our community members. And it's at little to no cost to you. So we are entirely run by volunteers. So if you have time and are interested in doing any volunteer work, you can go to our website at the PTC website at lthsptc.org and go under Get Involved, and we do have a volunteer program for that. And I just wanted to say we are so very excited to introduce our esteemed guest speaker for tonight, Dr. Doug Bolton. Doug is a licensed clinical psychologist and director of school consultation for formative psychological services. He spent over 20 years as a psychologist and as principal at North Shore Academy in Highland Park. Dr. Bolton provides consultation, supervision, and professional development to parents, educators, and clinicians throughout the Northern Illinois area to create these communities that help foster student and staff resilience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome Dr. Doug Bolton.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I'm glad you all were able to find a seat tonight. So here's the thing. I'm excited to be here and talk about something that's I've been thinking about since the beginning of COVID, is how can we take lessons from COVID with us forward? And I think there are some important lessons that we've learned. You know, we survived the storm together, and after the storm, the question is, what do we do from here? What's next? In the beginning of COVID, I remember thinking, I wish there was somebody who could lead us through a path through this, someone who's been through this before. And I wish my grandmother was still around. She was born in 1899, and she died about 30-something years ago. But when I thought about her life, I thought, what a remarkable series of events she went through. She was born and grew up in New York, and they suffered through the typhoid fever. Then we all know World War I came. She was 15. Polio outbreak a year later. We know about the Spanish flu, don't we? All before she was 20. And then the Roaring Twenties hit. Is this a great picture of her? I thought this was like a stock photo when my brother sent it to me. And then she, during the Roaring Twenties, she met and married my grandfather Walls. In 1929, they had my father. We all know what happens after that, right? Great Depression, followed by World War II. What a life her generation lived. And if that wasn't enough, right after the war, my grandfather died of a heart attack. And yet it was my grandmother, when my parents divorced, that was the rock in our lives. She had her own way with kids, didn't she? I love this picture. She hates it, but I love it. You know, she's the one who kept us together during the hardest times. She's the one that we relied on. I had no idea all that she had been through. What do we call her generation? We call it the greatest generation, don't we? And so as I think about this time, I think, what happens to this generation? I guess I want to let history be our guide. There were pandemics before this. There's the Black Plague, and that was the worst. It took 1 out of every 3 European lives. Can you imagine? And we all talk about the Spanish flu, but the COVID is dwarfed by the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu took between 50 million and 100 million lives worldwide. In each of these times, the world turned upside down. Each time, the cultures moved from pain to possibility. What happened after the Black Plague Renaissance? This remarkable time of explosion of technology and culture and commerce. The same thing really happened after the Spanish flu, didn't it? When things fall apart, we rebuild and we reconnect. And this is what happens. This is the power of families, as we come together when bad things happen. This is the power of schools. This is why I love working in schools, the power of community. Community is our superpower, and it drives our recovery from the hardest things in our lives. This is how we survive as a species. All these centuries. We have survived so many things as a species. And it's our ability to come together as a community. It's what gives us strength. And when we get through the hard times, we think differently. It's as if there was this time of incubation when everything shut down, and then we begin to think differently. That this disruption always leads to innovation, doesn't it? What will we change? What do we need to change as we've looked through the eyes of COVID? I like what Winston Churchill says. He says, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And that's my hope for today. The problem is life was hard for many kids pre-pandemic. There was a mental health crisis before COVID, wasn't there? Take a look at just some of these. Rates of depression rose more than 60% in our teenagers. The number of children and teenagers in the decade before COVID that were seen in emergency rooms with suicidal thoughts or attempts doubled. Our kids have been in pain for a long time, and this is the one, as an educator, that's most frightening for me. The suicide rate for children is 2 times higher when school is in session. It's not about the weather. For adults, it's higher in the summer. Something's happening in our cultures that while kids are in school, we're pushing them to the edge and often beyond. Right before COVID, students in high-achieving schools are now named an at-risk group. So all of a sudden, we've all known that other kids have been in an at-risk group, kids in poverty, kids with trauma, kids who experience discrimination. But also, take a look, this excessive pressure to excel is putting kids at risk for anxiety and depression, challenging their wellness. Children in high-achieving schools suffer significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, at least 3 to 7 times the national average. This is why they're so at risk. Our highest achieving kids are also suffering. And then we add COVID onto those mental health challenges. So the question is, can this pandemic help reverse the epidemic? That's my hope. And that's actually my belief, is that it can. So COVID began as a sprint, didn't it? Like all of a sudden, I think it was March 13th, everything shut down. And schools had to go remote. We all had to go remote in our work, right? And it felt like at the end of that first school year, and even at the end of the second, we were exhausted. But it felt like we were onto something. Things were gonna get better. And then it's like someone tapped us on the shoulder and said, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And the thing is, we cope with stress differently when it's acute versus chronic. When it's a marathon, we cope with it differently, we train differently than when it's a sprint. And the way we do this is through social emotional learning. You guys have all heard of this. It's the new buzzword in education, right? Social emotional learning. It's never been more important for our students. This is one of the things that schools are seeing, is that this is so very important, but it's also never been more important for us too. This is what social emotional learning is. This is so Castle is a research and practice training group for social emotional learning, the premier social emotional learning program in the country. And they say that there are 5 different parts of social emotional learning. There's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. It's interesting, Bruce Perry, who is the leader in resilience and trauma in kids, he says it's all about regulation, Kids being able to regulate their ability to be connected to other people through relationship, and that's how they access reason. And when theories dovetail, it tells me we're onto something. Take a look. Regulation is all about our ability to be aware of what's happening for us and our ability to manage it. Relationship is all about social awareness and our relationship skills. And that gets us to reason. Then we can make our best decisions. So COVID has been a classroom for all of us. And it's required us all to be more engaged in our own social emotional learning. Take a look at this. This is what we use in a lot of our schools, but especially in our elementary schools. This is zones of regulation. What zone are you in? Are you in the blue zone? Are you feeling kind of tired? Yeah, maybe. Are you feeling good and happy you just had a good dinner? Are you frustrated or stressed? Are you about to throw a chair or yell and scream at me, right? So this is what it looks like. I want you just to take a minute and take a look at what zone are you in right now. And think about what you need. You need to get up and move. You need to get a cup of coffee so you can get through the rest of this, whatever it looks like, right? This is an activity. So if you're sitting with someone, I just want you to just turn to that person for a second and share what zone you're in and what do you need. Just take a minute to think through that. How many people in the yellow zone? You got some yellows? Anybody in green? Anybody blue? I would be in blue. I'd be just about asleep right now. I go to bed early. So this is a social emotional learning lesson because it hits three of these things. This is one of the things that's so important for us, for our kids and for us, is to be aware of what's happening, to be able to take care of it before it causes problems for us, and to know what's happening for our kids and those around us. And then we can make our best decisions. And the interesting thing is Castle says, even before we talk about kids SEL, we've got to be aware of our own. We can't help our kids if we're not aware and able to manage our own regulation. Does that make sense? So this is why this is important for all of us. Our regulation comes first. And in our world, everything we need to be able to expand before we need to be able to explore. We're constantly asking kids to learn and engage in new things. But in order to do that, we also need to stop, recover, and then go again. This is how every cycle works. We work all day, and then we sleep and we recover. And then we work, we expand and we contract. Work. If we're in a sports team, we get together, we huddle up, we play the game, at halftime we contract, and we come back together, catch our breath, rest, and then go again. This is how it's supposed to work. But we need to contract, we need to get that sleep if we're gonna have a good day the next day. We need to be able to take a break before we move on to the next task. There's a rhythm to this that's essential for us. But the problem is that with our kids' lives, we have been doing a lot of expanding and taking away a lot of the contracting effort. We've continued to fill our kids' lives at school and at home with things and not giving them the opportunity to contract. And this is an important thing as we think about our parenting and what's happening for our kids, is we all need to contract. We all need to be able to get that breath. So I want to talk about 5 guiding lessons from COVID. These are the things that I've learned. The first is, we don't need to be perfect, we just need to show up. Who was perfect during COVID? Right? None of us. The thing about COVID is that it was stressful. We'd never experienced it before. It was constant. It was global. It was intense. People were dying. People were losing their jobs. It was an extraordinary time with extraordinary stress. But also, I think there's been extraordinary opportunity. What happens in our brains, and you guys know this, is that when we're stressed, we go into the lower parts of our brain. And when we go there, we lose access to our cortex. Take a look at the things our cortex helps us do. It helps us to listen. It helps us to be creative, to be flexible, to have empathy, to keep our, who else struggled with memory during the hardest parts of COVID? Anybody? It was hard, right? That's because we're in lower brain. Our language shifts. All of a sudden, the only words I could think of were 4-letter words, and I felt like I needed to spell them all the time, right? This is what happens. Or we shut down and we can't find the words, we're so upset. And then we lose our inhibition, we become more impulsive. This is what happens in our brain. If you took a brain scan of me, I think this is what my brain would have looked like for most of COVID, right? But here's the thing. We really didn't show up as the same colleagues or friends or spouses or parents. And I don't know about you, I still feel like I'm just getting my energy and focus back. People's motivation and optimism took a big hit. This night was that our kids had limitations, teachers had limitations, we had limitations. Guess what happens when that happens? We aren't going to learn as much, are we? What are we until we worry? What are our kids learning during this time? And here's the thing: they may not have gotten the same rigorous instruction during those 2 years of COVID or whenever they were online and remote, even when they were social distancing. Teachers had to do everything differently. Students had to do everything differently. But the whole time we were teaching resilience, like never before. T.W. Winnicott was a pediatrician and a psychoanalyst in the 1940s. And he had this theory, he called it the good enough mother. The interesting thing was at that time, there were all of these theories about parenting, and if you had to do everything just right, and if you got it wrong, your kids would suffer. Well, when it said, he said, no, that's not true. We just need to be good enough. And he went on to say, and I love this, babies and children actually benefit when their mothers or fathers or teachers or coaches fail them in manageable ways. And this manageable is important, isn't it? If I forget to pick up my son at baseball practice and he has to find his way back, that's inconvenient and hard, but then he realizes unexpected things can happen. And I can figure it out. These are important lessons, right? So the question is, can we be good enough as parents? And just good enough. We don't need to be perfect. The problem is, and I think this is something that this generation of parents struggles with more than any other, is this inner critical. If our kids are in distress, it's a reflection on us. There's something wrong if our kids are unhappy. If we don't do things just right, we become flooded with these things. Brene Brown said, sometimes the bravest and most important thing we can do is just show up. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to show up. Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson wrote this book called The Power of Showing Up, and what they talk about is how, not parental perfection, but how parental presence changes and wires kids' brains. So what does that mean? They talk about showing up as meaning 4 different things. The first is helping them feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure. So safe is protecting them from harm. We spent all sorts of time during COVID, didn't we, trying to protect kids from harm, the harm of COVID and infection. But there's also psychological safety, the sense that I can be safe. I'm safe to explore things. I'm safe to go off on my own. I'm safe to make mistakes. This safety is also really important. But what we need to do as parents is to figure out how do we not become the source of fear that undermines their sense of safety. The mistake we make is we can lose it with our kids. Anyone else lose it with their kids over COVID? I hope I'm not the only one. Thank you, we got a couple, right? We're going to lose it sometimes. But that's where our awareness is so important. And when we lose it, it's okay. We all lose our tempers sometimes. But then the question is, can we forgive ourselves? And then can we make it right? Because there are lessons learned in making it right. Because your kids are going to screw up and they're going to lose their tempers too, aren't they? And then the work is we can show them how to do that when we make it right with them. The second is helping them feel seen, and this is about this kind of sense of attunement. We are wired to be attuned to our infant. I'm not sure how many of you have had infants recently. I certainly haven't. But I'll tell you, I was holding one the other day, and when they made a face, I would mimic it. You ever notice you can't hold a baby without mimicking the expression they're making? It's almost impossible. That's hardwired. You know what happens? It's the beginning of our social emotional development. Because what happens in this infant is they feel something that shows up in their face. And when we mimic it, they say, oh, that's what that feeling looks like. That's what that is. And this is how we learn how to read each other and to read ourselves. And it's happening all the time, isn't it? Right? All the time. Some people take it too far, right? And as kids get older, this is what it looks like. It's this ability to listen. It's the ability to try and be attuned, to be curious what their experience is, what's happening to them. And let them know their feelings are real, even if we don't agree with them, even if we wish they didn't have those feelings, their feelings are real and they're fleeting, like all of our feelings are. The mistake we make is we try and fix it, don't we? A little bit of distress and we want to rush in and we want to fix it, but that keeps them from fixing it themselves and learning they can fix it themselves, or we minimize it. We feel uncomfortable. Why would you worry about something as stupid as that? That's ridiculous. That will never happen. Right? And all of a sudden, that's a message about being not attuned, or we can shame them. You're acting like your younger sister. Whatever that looks like. Right? What do we do instead? We soothe. But that's our work. In these moments when they're so distressed, can we just be there and soothe them? When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. It's really hard when our kids are distressed not to be distressed as well. Dysregulation is really contagious. And yet, if we can be calm, in their calm, and realize they can ride this thing out too. And then ideally, as they get this, they can begin to soothe themselves. And that's the holy grail for younger kids that may be teddy bears, for older kids that may be putting their AirPods in, or walking the dog, or whatever. But this is the work, is to help them learn how to soothe, but the mistake we make is we punish instead of soothe. This picture, I love this picture because it said there's so much shame in this boy, isn't there? Take a look, he's got his head facing the wall, his head is bent. Look, he's got his dog there, Charlie. It's as if I had said to him, go take a time out, you're being really mean to your sister. But I wish I had said, because you're upset, I'm upset, why don't you and Charlie go and calm down, and I'm going to calm down, and we're going to come back together and we're going to figure this out. That's how we help them learn how to soothe. But we get impatient. One of the things about dysregulation is it makes us impatient, it makes us impulsive. We just need to give it time. We need to give it time in the moment. But we also need to know that just because they struggle with it when they're younger, this is all developmental. It's all part of their brain's development. They'll get better at this as they get older. Just because they struggle with dysregulation now or struggle with overreacting to things doesn't mean we have to punish them out of it. That's not going to help. What helps is that brain development. That's our work, is to help that brain develop. And then, if we help them feel safe and seen and soothed, then they've got a secure base in which they can explore the world. They can go out into the world. I like this. I found this actually there's a sink here because it's from a middle school bathroom. And I walked in, I was giving a talk on resilience, and there's the best definition of resilience, right in the bathroom wall. You have within you right now everything you need to deal with whatever the world will throw at you. So this is how we help them do that. But first, we've got to realize that good enough is good enough for them and for us. And that there's beauty in imperfection. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we've got to know that our kids are watching. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them. They're watching how we cope with things. That's how they're learning how to cope themselves. So the Nahum often wrote, note to self, all you have to do is show up, be late, be scared, be a mess, be weird, be confused, just be there. Figure out the rest as you go. This is kind of me during COVID. It was messy. It was hard. And we got through it. I'm sorry about this little slide. So lesson 2, should be lesson 2. We learned a lot about stress. So here's the good news for you guys tonight. I'm going to give you the secret that's going to increase your life expectancy by 43%. Aren't you glad you came? Not bad, right? All right, so they gave this question to thousands of people. If you had to sum up how you feel about stress, which statement would be more accurate? Stress is harmful and should be avoided at all costs. Or stress is helpful, it should be accepted, utilized, and embraced. Guess if you and 85% of people believe B, right? 85% of Americans believe stress has a negative impact on family, health, and work and life, right? Then in 1997, they did an interesting study. They asked two questions. How much stress have you experienced in the last year? And do you believe that stress is harmful to your health? And then they went and they followed up with these people 8 years later. But they didn't follow up with these 30,000 people in person. They checked death records. They wanted to see who was still alive. Isn't that interesting? Here's the bad news. Is that if you experience if you say you're experiencing high stress and believe that stress is harmful, you have a 43% increased risk of dying. The good news is that even in a high stress condition, it didn't increase your risk of dying if you believe that stress wasn't harmful. Isn't that interesting? So there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Believing that stress is helpful makes stress helpful. Really? I'm a psychologist, and this is hard to believe. Our beliefs about stress are more important to our health than our actual stress? How could that be? So here's the thing. They followed up. They actually figured out why. Because when we believe that stress is harmful, our stress response gets triggered, which triggers all the systems in our body. It triggers our heart rate and everything else. And when we're stressed, we can get a break from that. But when we're stressed and then we believe that stress is bad for us, we never get a break from that stress. And so what they found is when they looked at people's blood vessels, people believe that stress is helpful, their blood vessels were actually dilated. And people who believe that stress is harmful, they were more constricted, leading to heart problems. So how can this be? I still think this is interesting. I'm not making this up. Charlie McGonigal wrote a great book about stress. Go buy a book about stress. That's just what you need now, right? So here's the thing. I want you to think about a time in your life that was a period of significant personal growth, a turning point that led to positive changes for newly found purpose. Anybody have one? You want to share one? That one? Some people say going to graduate school. Some people say caring for a child with special needs. Some people say caring for a parent who's dying. Worse. Thing is, whatever it is that you were thinking of, was it stressful? The interesting thing is, the things that have meaning for us are stressful. They don't have meaning. It's not stressful. I'm a Yankees fan. I'm sorry. I'm a Yankees fan. If the Yankees are in the playoffs aren't stressful for me, right? Because I don't care. If we didn't care about the health of our kids and the futures of our kids, if we didn't care about the health of our families, if we didn't care about our teachers and the people that are our neighbors, COVID wouldn't have been as stressful. Stress occurs when something we care about is at stake. This is an important connection. Raising children increases daily stress, right? Life would be less stressful without kids, for crying out loud. We'd have a lot more money too, wouldn't we? Raising children increases daily stress and the number of times we smile and laugh. Entrepreneurs have high levels of stress, but they also report the highest levels of learning. Stress is an inevitable consequence of engaging in roles and pursuing goals that feed our sense of purpose. We're stressed. It's important that we recognize that there's something important happening for us. Feeling stressed then is a barometer for how engaged you are in activities and relationships that are personally meaningful. Meaning and stress are interrelated. Meaning is the most important things we can have for resilience. Parenting has never been more stressful or meaningful for us. Both are true. So how do we cope? Well, what we want to do is we want to ground the meaning in our values. I want you to take a minute and just think, why did you become a parent? There are values that you have. What drove your decision to become a parent? Think a minute, what are those values? And how did those values show up during COVID? It was harder during COVID because the things that we wanted to be able to help our kids accomplish were harder. We had to work harder. He gave this to kids, and this worked with kids and with all of us. What they did was they had kids from Stanford on their break talk about the things they disliked during their break. And they had some kids write about just what were some of the hassles during break, and then they had the other ones write what are some of the hassles during break, and what are the values that showed up for why you did those things. Writing about values helped students see the meaning in their lives. Stressful experiences were no longer things to endure, they became an expression of our values. And this is how we shift from stress as harmful to stress as helpful. And it's amazing how just this small intervention, months later, can lead to kids feeling more powerful in control, prouder and stronger, and increase their GPA and improve their health. What happens is these values, these deep-seated values, fuel our sense of meaning, and that's what helps us be resilient. And so these values showed up for you and for everybody else to get through COVID. Lesson 3. We're more adaptable than we ever imagined. There's a guy named Tom Boyce who did research in Wisconsin. He tracked kids from preschool all the way up to post-high school. And he observed them at home and in school. They took saliva samples to see how stressed they were. And he wanted to get a sense of how kids dealt with stresses in their lives. And what he said is that there are dandelion kids and there are orchid kids. He said dandelion kids are kids who can grow up in just about any environment, right? Like they can grow up in concrete, they can survive thunderstorms and my lawnmower every time, right? The orchids aren't like that. The orchids are beautiful, but they need the right amount of soil, the right amount of water, right? With the right temperature. They're much more sensitive to their environment. Here's what he found. 80% of kids are dandelion kids. This is an interesting statistic because it shows up with kids who experience war-torn areas. It shows up in kids who've experienced natural disasters. 80% of kids, I'm not saying they like it, don't get me wrong. They do okay. Resilience is the norm and not the exception. That means 20% of kids are orchid kids. 20% of kids are going to be more sensitive. 20% of kids had a harder time during COVID than the others, right? So what do we do with those orchid kids? What happens is we end up assuming they're lazy, they don't care, that they just want to get out of stuff, right? But the question is, can we just ask them? One of the things as a psychologist, as a parent, that I wish I had known earlier is when kids are struggling, can I just be curious? Because I always make assumptions about what's happening. And yet asking them, I always learn something new that's helpful. There's a guy who was he was a teacher right after COVID started, and there was do no harm grading. He was a teacher for a senior class, AP English. One kid didn't show up. All the rest of the kids showed up, even though they were going to get good grades. They were going to get fine grades. But he said, I knew that kid wouldn't show up because he always was just going to mail it in. 4 weeks later, the kid finally reaches out. Hadn't been on Zoom, hadn't attended the class, and said, can we talk? And he said, yeah, you can talk. So they showed up on a Zoom meeting. The kid was terrible. He said, my parents both lost their jobs. They're fighting. I think they're going to get a divorce. My best friend took his own life 3 weeks ago. I can't even show my face outside of my room, much less on a Zoom meeting. I can't focus on anything. Boy, did he wish he asked instead of just assuming. Every kid has a story of struggling. Every kid has a story behind that struggle that will break our hearts. Can we be curious? That's all. The bad news is that COVID was an accelerant. Marriages, relationships that worked hard got harder. It also accelerated good relationships. The marriage satisfaction went up for the people who stayed married. The divorce rates also went up. Vulnerable and children and families were at greater risk during COVID, period. And a major driver of child well-being during COVID was how well the parents are functioning. I believe that's true outside of COVID too. Take a look at this. Perceived parental criticism and unreachable standards predicts child depression. And here's the interesting thing is it's perceived. Kids have perceptions about us. It may not be what we say. We communicate this in a lot of different ways, or they may just perceive it. Take a look at this. 90% of parents report that their top priority for their child is that they're caring. This is what parents think they're communicating to their kid. 81% of children report that their parents value achievement and happiness over caring. Just because we don't think that we're giving them that message or that's the message they're getting, just know that they're often getting different messages from us than we think they are. So here's the good news. Anyone heard of post-traumatic growth? People who experience adversity often see positive growth afterwards and a rise to an even higher level of functioning. A traumatic event, it turns out, is not simply a hardship to be overcome. Instead, it's transformative. It becomes a dividing line in people's lives. Here's what the research says. People who experience post-traumatic growth have increased inner strength, an openness to new possibilities in life, closer and deeper relationships with friends and family, an enhanced appreciation for life, and stronger sense of spirituality. And here's the kicker. Post-traumatic growth is more common than post-traumatic stress. Even though we talk a lot more about post-traumatic stress. Resilience, it turns out, is learned, and it's learned in the hardest times. When people are asked how they're coping with the biggest stresses in their lives, 82% say they're drawing on strength developed from past experiences. Our kids and we are going to face challenges in the future, and we're going to be stronger because we knew we've gone through this. Take a look at what Eileen Zimmerman says. You can think of resilience as a set of skills that can be learned. Part of the skill building comes from exposure to very difficult but manageable experiences. Take a look at that wording. It's the same thing that Winnicott said, wasn't it? If we can make it manageable, then kids benefit. People like you as parents, educators, everybody did everything we could to make this manageable. And for many kids, for most kids, we were able to make this manageable. It's unmanageable, unexpected, unprecedented moment in our history, and we made it manageable for kids, for many kids. So here's the thing, there's something called toxic optimism. I'm not saying we're better off, we should be glad we went through COVID. That's not the message. Tragic optimism is the ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain and loss and suffering. And there are still people experiencing great pain and loss and suffering. What we need to do is be able to hold both of these truths, because they're both true. Lesson 4. We focus on family because we had to. We all had to be at home together and share bandwidth together, right? It was a crazy time. But this family connection makes all the difference. I want to talk about a study from Google, right? You want to know an answer, you Google it. Well, Google does a lot of research, and he wanted to know what makes teams effective. I think this is what makes families effective, and also what makes classrooms effective. What they found is great teams have 2 qualities. The first is equal airtime, which means everybody's voice matters. As long as everyone got a chance to talk, the team did well, but if only one person or a small group spoke all the time, the collective intelligence declined. And the other is attunement. We talked about attunement before. This idea that we can read and understand and are attuned to what other people are feeling. The good teams all had a high average social sensitivity. A fancy way of saying, we're skilled at knowing how other people are feeling. We know them well enough to know their stories. We can read them well enough. Their tone of voice, their expressions, and other nonverbal cues. And this is what creates psychological safety. This ability to say, my voice matters in my family, in my classroom. Amy Edmondson does research on psychological safety, and what she says is psychological safety is about feeling safe to take a risk. If I take that risk, I'm not going to be humiliated or ashamed at the dinner table, in the classroom, It's a climate in which we can all be ourselves. When we can capture that, this is how our brains grow. It's how we become more resilient. Great families need these two qualities too. Everybody has a voice. We're attuned to one another. This is our work. I want to talk a little bit about family dinners. We didn't do family dinners until COVID, and then we had 4 months of family dinners. It was kind of amazing. I knew that there was good research on family dinners. We just couldn't figure it out because everybody was way too busy, right? But here's the thing, the research on family dinners is pretty clear. Families who have family dinners, kids' vocabulary, achievement, and reading scores go way up. Empathy and social skills, because they're learning social skills around the table by watching us and interacting with us. This is how we learn, is in relationship with other people. And suicide, substance abuse, depression, aggression, and sex are all less prevalent in families that have teenage sex, I'll say, right? Not a bad list. I like the idea of grace. This is what grace does, and it doesn't need to be a religious thing, right? But here's what grace does. We typically get quiet, we hold hands, so we're touching. This is an important piece, and there's a moment of meditation, and there's often some gratitude involved. All of these things, like I said, it doesn't have to be faith-based, but all of these things are important boosters of mental health for all of us. It's not about the broccoli. And our children are watching. They're watching how we interact. They're learning how to cope with frustration, how to deal with conflict by watching how we interact. And this sense of belonging is really, really important. They took a look at 12,000 teenagers and found the most powerful protective factors for every sort of adolescent risk behavior, emotional distress, drug abuse, violence, and suicidality is 2 things: their sense of belonging at school and their sense of belonging at home. You want to help your kids reduce emotional distress, drug abuse, violence, and suicidality, the first thing we need to do is make sure that home is a place where they feel like they belong, where it's psychologically safe. Students with a strong sense of belonging are more motivated to learn, perform better academically, have better attendance, engage in less misconduct, are healthier, have higher self-esteem, and better mental health. Not bad. This is our work as parents. When I talk to teens, school teens, this is our work as teens. This well-being pyramid, right? We take care of ourselves, but also our group is really important for our well-being. And then the system we're in is also important for our well-being, right? But here's the thing, during COVID, it was hard. There were plenty of times when I'm like, one more downward dog is not gonna help, right? This is hard, this is stressful. Breathing is not getting me there. There's power in this group. There's a lot within the systems we can't fix. But there's a lot in a group that we can fix. So just take a look at the stress. There's different degrees of stress. There's positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. Positive stress is this, you're giving a presentation at work. So you're anxious, but then it goes away. Tolerable stress is a significant stress. It's an injury, a bad injury. It's a loss of someone you love. And toxic stress is this ongoing trauma. Take a look at what both of all these definitions say. That with tolerable and toxic stress, that positive relationships buffer the stress. Toxic relationships are buffered by connected relationships, these positive buffering relationships. This is what creates a connective tissue for resilience, is embedding kids in places where there's a connection. At home and at school, their teams, wherever it may be, many as we can. And then finally, we learned about the pressure we're putting on our children. Something unexpected happened in the spring of 2020. This is what the researchers found, and it surprised me. Sunaya Luther did research on this. She said the well-being of students, and these are the higher functioning kids, the well-being of these high functioning kids actually improved as classes and exams were canceled grading moved to pass fail, and extracurricular activities ceased. They reported lower levels of stress, anxiety, and depression compared to the year before. I know a lot of kids were suffering in unprecedented ways, but on average, the kids in high-performing schools started feeling less anxiety and depression. They may not have been happy to have their seasons canceled, but they had less homework. And so when they came home, there was less. The first discussion when an 8th grader got home isn't what homework do you have and when are you going to get it done? It's what are we going to do tonight? Kids got more sleep. My daughter was a senior at Evanston Township High School, and she's in a statistics class, and they take statistics every year on how much sleep people get just to do their statistical analysis. They have data about how much sleep kids report getting. During COVID, they were getting almost an hour more sleep per night. Is that a big deal? 1 hour of sleep? If you think symptoms of ADHD, obesity, behavior problems, academic skills, and social skills have anything to do with it, absolutely. All of these things are improved with 1 hour of sleep. And yet now, as compared to 1980, kids in 1980 were getting an hour more sleep than they're getting now. And we wonder why kids are struggling in these ways. I think that's a big reason why they're struggling more now than they were before. A sleepy 6th grader will perform in class like a 4th grader. A loss of 1 hour of sleep is equal to the loss of 2 years of cognitive development in that class. You ever been really tired and tried to focus in a meeting and present something? It's really hard. Kids' schedules got simpler, right? They didn't have to be travel teams anymore. Your steering wheels didn't look like this. It's stressful for parents and kids to have that many activities going on. And guess what those activities do? It means we never sit down for dinner anymore. We're never together as a family. We're always looking for the shin pads, right? This is what we do. And so we had all these things going. Kids were getting a little bit healthier. And then we blew it, didn't we? What she found is that just a few months later, as these improvements were short-lived, beginning in the fall of 2020, as school work ramped back up, the mental health of adolescents returned to pre-pandemic levels or worse. What we know is that our lives need to be consistent with our biology. We need to move more. Kids aren't meant to sit for so many hours in school. They need to be outdoors more. Kids were outdoors more during COVID. They need to be collaborative. They need to be connected. Even when kids came back and they were socially distanced and masked, it was the hardest. Teachers will say this was the hardest year when the kids came back because nobody could connect with one another. Even though we were in space, they were disconnected. We want them to be curious, not focused on what grade am I going to get. They need to breathe. They need to slow down. They need to contract in order to expand. If I told my wife, hey, listen, I've got a plan for this next year. I'm going to wake up at 5:30. I'm going to play some basketball with my buddies, and I'm going to do a full day's work. I'm probably not going to work right. I'm probably going to work right through lunch so I can get to band practice because I'm going to hang out and be in a garage band with my buddies every night. I'm going to practice. I'm going to get my Stairway to Heaven down, and I'm going to get home, and I'm not going to have time to eat, but I'll just warm something up. I'll take it into the den, and I'm going to work and do my email until midnight or 1 o'clock. What would she say? She'd say, the divorce papers will be waiting for you right there, right? She'd say that's not healthy. And yet if our kids aren't doing that, at some level we think there's something wrong. You're not active enough. You're not involved enough. You must not have enough homework. The thing we want to do is we want to try not to, we're worried that so not only is it part of our culture that this is the expectation for kids and for parents, but when they were in remote learning, we're worried now we got to get caught up, right? They've got to do more now. The thing is, their brains are plastic, and this is really important. They're going to struggle more because they didn't get as much practice with these things for a while, for a couple months. Larry Steinberg, developmental psychologist, kind of preeminent developmental psychologist, said they're going to be fine, and the reason is built right into their biology. They're going through a critical period of heightened brain flexibility, instability, and plasticity, which means they're hypersensitive. and hyper vulnerable and extra primed to take advantage of this time in their lives. That's the beauty of it, is their brains can recover. Do kids need certain kinds of experiences at this point in their lives in order to be able to develop normally? Yes, but there's no reason to think an interruption like this is going to cause permanent damage. The plasticity afforded by the childhood learning allows for this recovery. They're going to be okay. As long as we don't continue to pile on the stress. Was it a lost 2 years, or was it a year of discovery and transformation? COVID shined a light on us as parents, shined a light on our community, on our schools, and our kids. David Foster Wallace gave the commencement address 2005 at Kenyon College. He told this story. He said there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods to them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell's water?" He said the immediate point of the fish story is that the most obvious, ubiquitous, and important realities are often the hardest ones to see and talk about. I think pressure we're putting on kids, pressure that kids put on themselves, the pressure that as educators we put on kids. It's hard for us to see. It's even harder for us to talk. For a little bit of time, we really get out of the water. And the healthier families, the families that struggle, really struggle, the healthier families will tell you that they spend more time together, or more connected. Now that we know what we need. The flip side of COVID, opportunity often comes disguised in the form of misfortune or temporary defeat. And I'll tell you, during COVID, I can't think of a time when I felt more misfortune or more defeated during that time. The world turned upside down for all of us. But here's the thing, we could not helicopter parent our kids out of this, could we? They needed to cope with this. They needed to, because there's nothing we could do about this. We couldn't snowplow parent our way to our kids, the stress away from our kids, could we? We can rebuild. And this is our work, is to rebuild. But we need to be intentional, don't we? I think that we're going to have a generation of kids who's going to come out of this, and they may still be struggling now. Many are still struggling now, but the story's not over on this. And I believe we've asked kids to be more independent, to be more resilient, and more community focused. And I believe that we're going to have a generation of kids that's more independent, more resilient, and more community focused when we get through this, if we do this right. 10 years from now, what will kids remember? I don't think they're going to say, you know, in 4th grade, my fractions class was online and I really wasn't very good, and so I didn't get into Purdue's engineering school. I don't think they're going to say that. You know what they're going to say? Is we got hit with a tidal wave. We went through one of the hardest times in American history. And I watched my parents adapt, and I watched my teachers adapt, and I adapted. I made this work. And when we pull back the curtain on COVID, I think we're going to have discovered some things that are going to be very important for us and for the next generation of kids. You know, in March 2020, COVID came in. We were writing a pretty good story. We felt like we had it figured out, most of us. Bumps along the way, but COVID came in, they took paper and pencil right out of our hands, didn't they? But we get to write the next chapter. And I'm excited about what we're doing today. All right, that's it for me. But we got some questions, thank you. I'd love to answer any questions if you have them, or any comments, or if you need to rush out of here, that's okay too. Whatever you guys need, but I'd love to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
What you're saying, you notice differences in age groups of kids. Can you express it in a quick way, or do you feel like everyone's kind of?
Yeah, so the question is there a difference in age group, right? For kids who are struggling most, is there a group that's struggling most? You know, it's interesting, in the schools, when kids came back last year, the group that I I found seemed to struggle the most. There were a lot of kids who were struggling across the board. But the early kindergarten, first and second graders, those principals and teachers were running around chasing kids around schools like they never had before. And I think that that was it. So it's, as I think about it in my experience, that's what I'm seeing. But I also think that anybody who was vulnerable to psychological distress to begin with, I think it turned the volume up on for all of us. And we all became more stressed, a little less mentally healthy for that time. And there are some kids who are still very much struggling. So I don't mean to make light of that in any way. There are plenty of kids who are still struggling in profound ways. But as a whole, kids were able to navigate this better than we would have ever imagined if we said we were going to go through this. We said we're never going to make it through. Most kids are doing okay. Does that make sense? Thanks. Great question. Yeah.
But I work with the folder. So now the parents realize that somehow my kids still end up sometimes hearing each other. Or, you know, years later, when something comes up, you know, oh, I got an app that doesn't do it, and that's great. We're looking at the right way to that. It's not happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for people who didn't hear it. And I'll summarize it if I get this right, which is so often we're trying to give our kids one message and they're getting another one. And what do we do about that, right? You know, it's an interesting thing because I was aware of all this before COVID when my kids were going off to college, and I could feel it as part of being in the water, right? If my kids weren't getting into like all these people, there's a little rating scale about how selective a college you get into. It has nothing to do with people's happiness or success, by the way. What college you get into doesn't matter. What matters is if you find a professor, regardless of what college it is, that mentors you. That's really the thing that does it, right? But here we have all of these messages. And so when, my son's going to St. Lawrence University in New York State, and he's always one of the brightest kids in his class. And people were like, oh, I've never heard of that. I thought you'd be going to Harvard or whatever, right? And he's so happy there. And he struggled, right? But what I realized was in myself, what do we talk about when we meet other people and we find out they have kids? We say, what do you do? What do their kids do? What do you do? What do your kids do? As if they should have a resume, right? It's an interesting thing that's so embedded in all of our thinking about kids. And so what I would say is I would get back to the values. I would check my values. And the thing is that we can say that your mental health is more important than your grades, but then when they come home with a poor grade and we get really upset about it, which is more important to them? And then all of a sudden we get dysregulated and maybe we become more shaming around that. These are powerful messages. So I think the first thing is just checking ourselves. And what is it that we're really communicating to our kids? And then sharing values. This is why this is important. This is why this is a value for me or for our family. Great question. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
And also with this last
I believe so, yeah. It's a really good question. Is that did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
No, no.
Yeah, so the question is, given whether we know that stress as we experience, so that when kids experience stress and the stress that we're putting on them, are we putting them at higher risk for health problems? And I think the answer is yes, right? That's what happens. The key thing, there's something they call the hedonic treadmill, which is when we focus on achievement, we can never get enough. Because we get to the finish line, and then there's another one, right? I aced my SAT, so now I gotta get to the best college. I got into Harvard, so now I gotta get into the best medical school or law school. And then I've gotta get into the best law firm. And then I've gotta get the corner office. And then I gotta be partner. When does it end? Right? I like this, someone said, this is like what we put kids through is like, it's like entering them in a pie eating contest. And the prize for winning is a pie, right? Like that's what we're doing. And we need to be really careful about this, right? Part of it is that there's this belief that, and I can go on about this for a long time, but this belief that having more money makes us happier. Once we reach a certain amount of money, it doesn't make us happier on most scales of happiness, right? We believe in that. We believe that to get there, we've got to get to a highly selective school in order to get the job we want to get, to be able to pay for the lifestyle that's going to make us happy, right? And there's no end to that. And the research doesn't support it. And so what we want to do is we want to check all that stuff and figure out what are our values. It's important that kids be able to play in activities and be on sports teams. How many sports teams is too much? A lot of parents will say, my kid wants to play all these sports. Why would I say no? And if they want 3 ice cream sundaes, would you give them 3 ice cream sundaes? Probably not, right? And so why wouldn't we do that? How can you say no to them? You can say, well, these are our values as a family. Because it's hard for us to have all three of you kids on 3 travel teams and still be able to have dinner together and have time together as a family. That's our value. So we're going to say you need to pick one. My guess is they're not going to make the major leagues in the 2 they can choose, right? So does that help answer your question? Other thoughts or comments or questions? Yeah. 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 Yeah, so the question is, this is on Zoom, so they want me to repeat all the questions. I know you guys can hear each other, but they want to repeat it for the Zoom audience. So here's the thing that's interesting about that. So the question is, kids are getting an hour less sleep than they were in 1980, and a big part of that is technology. Right? This idea that they are constantly being inundated, and technology companies are making sure that they're continuing to hit those dopamine triggers for us to keep us, this endless scroll keeps us looking for the next thing, right? This not wanting to be left out in technology from a social perspective in adolescence is really, really hard because you can always be left out now. And so I think that's that's one of the big challenges for us, right? Another interesting thing that happened in the 1980s was that the U.S. News and World Reports came out, I think in 1984, with the first best colleges in the country list. And all of a sudden there was scarcity there. People didn't care quite as much. Maybe if you got into an Ivy League, but people didn't care when I was going to college, like where you went. There wasn't this kind of sense of, knowing where everybody was, being aware of your classroom. There's none of that stuff happening either. I think there's a lot of things that have changed in society, but technology is a huge one regarding sleep. But also, I think that there's more pressure to achieve than ever before that we're putting on our kids as well. And also, kids are playing on 3 teams, don't get me wrong, but the teams would be in season. And so all of a sudden you weren't having to play 3 travel teams and have off-season workouts, and all of a sudden everything has been ramped up to expecting a level of excellence and achievement from kids, sports-wise, academically, that we never had to do, at least when I was a kid. That wasn't part of the culture. Thank you. Yeah.
Share your thoughts or insights you have on the effect of COVID and developmental progress to your relationship among teams.
Yeah, the question is the impact of COVID on the development of social skills, really, in teenagers. You know, I'll tell you what, first of all, I made this mistake once. I'm a big masker, so don't get me wrong. I believe in masks. I think that masks are important. But I also think we've got to hold both truths in our hands as well, that masks really impacted our ability to read one another. It impacted teachers' ability to read kids and kids' ability to read teachers, to be able to read each other, to be able to not be able to have this practice is a big deal, right? Not being able to have 2 years of reading each other and learning what that expression means and how I respond to that. All of these things are important. So yes, I think there's a lot of social skills. I think that there's kids who may be more anxious because developmentally they're in one place, but socially they may be in another place. And so I think this is going to be tricky for a lot of kids at this time. And I think that 5 years from now, they're going to be fine if we continue to help support them through this, if that makes sense. Just because they're behind now, just because there's this, it's off, it's misaligned, doesn't mean it won't become aligned more later. Does that make sense? This part of their brain has a ton of development to do. If they're 14, it's only that part of their brain that manages this is only halfway developed. So there's a lot of development, a lot of repair that can happen. Great question. Yeah.
We found out that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was, I talked to. She did what? She was from
Yeah, that's a really good question. Question is, how do we help our kids when, even when we do everything, we do the right thing, we get them into therapy to help them, and yet they're not going to share. They're not sharing all the things that they need to be sharing. So, you know, one of my beliefs about being a therapist myself, and I'm not sure if you would share this, but one of the things that's important, sometimes it's less important for us to process all the events in our lives as it is to just have a relationship that we feel like is stable and constant. So she still can be getting benefit. Is it she? Did I hear you right? Your daughter? Yeah. She can still be getting benefit from this. The other thing is, it's my belief as a psychologist who works with kids that there's a lot less that I can do with 50 minutes a week. And so much more can happen in their family and in their schools. And so I think that you've got, even if she's not speaking with you, making sure that you're open, that you see what's happening for her, that you can read what's happening for her, that you care without becoming overly caring and overly involved, finding a way to have good boundaries with her, but also let her know that you're attuned to what's happening for her. That lots can change over the course of several years. And I had a son who went through the same thing, and or maybe he was just telling his reality and my reality was different, right? But either way you look at it, 5 years later, he's doing really well. I think the therapy was helpful, but there was a lot more that part of it was brain development, part of it was finding a community in college. It was better for him than his community in high school. So there's a lot of things that can change. I do think that one of the biggest things we can do is embed kids with the communities, more than just relying on one person 50 minutes a week to be there to answer those problems. Yeah, your wisdom, yeah.
So I was texting her, and I reached out to my brother-in-law and said, talk to them. Actually, stop.
Your brother-in-law could give him the stuff. That's exactly right, right? Yeah. That he can't handle it, right? Yeah, so the question is, when you've got a child who's struggling with a breakup, oftentimes our anxiety, and that's where we want to fix it, right? We want to take it away, but can we just be okay, know that they're going to get through this? We've all been through hard breakups. I didn't go running to my parents to talk about it, right? Like some kids can and some kids won't, but they'll find their way, they'll find their path through it. And it's our work to help them find their path through it. And I think that having a brother-in-law or someone else, I don't think they need to talk to them about it. I think this is similar to your daughter, but maybe they just need to come and say, hey, let's do something. Let's go fishing together. I haven't seen you in a while. So there you go. Without your help. And I'll bet you started showering again all of a sudden, right? All right. Other questions? Well, thank you all. Such good questions. And I'm so glad that you all came out tonight. And thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to PCN. PCN, did I get it right? For putting this on. So thank you all so very much.
And please don't forget to take, we have, we'll get some, love notes. Please don't forget to take those to you. Remember.
They're great. They're on the table.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys.